project. Amy is... This is the Town of Washington Historical Society meeting on September 25th, 1997. We are meeting at the Little Rest Chapel on Little Rest Road and Route 343 in the Town of Washington. Our guest speaker is Carmen D. Arpine, historian for the Town of Washington Historical Society, and Amy Olsen, who restored and repainted and cleaned out the back room of the Little Rest Chapel as part of a...
And I'm going to introduce Amy Olsen, who is a local high school student. She's in the 12th grade. She's a senior this year, going on to college to study psychology, is my understanding. And I'm going to let Amy present the program, and Carmine is going to help her wherever needed. Thank you, Amy.
Hi, as Scott said, I'm Amy Olsen, and I'm a senior at Millbrook High School. I first became interested in the history of the chapel while working on my Girl Scout Gold Award project. The Gold Award is the Girl Scout equivalent to the Boy Scout Eagle rank, and it involves several interest projects, a career exploration pin, a leadership award, the challenge, which develops self-awareness, and then finally the project, which culminates everything that has been learned in the previous requirements. What I decided to do for my project was to clean out the back room here at the Little Rest Chapel, and it had been used as storage for many years since the Perkins family bought the property in 1950. It had just been used as storage. They bought the property along with Walbridge Farm across the street and the house. The back room was full of just old paraphernalia that had been shoved in there, and no one really knew what it was, so it all had to be taken out, cleaned out. It actually took me an entire afternoon just to sweep the floor because there was so much dust, and it needed to be repainted and refurbished so that it would be able to be used again. I spent a lot of time here while working on my project, and I came across an article written by Helen Mazur in 1983, and she had done quite a bit of research on the history of the chapel for the Millbrook Roundtable. So I used that as a jumping off point to start my research. I was also able to find information from the record books at the Lyle Memorial Federated Church, and I was also able to get information from local people who had lived here for a long time. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of information about the chapel. It's almost as if it was forgotten and people didn't take the time to write down the events that occurred here. First of all, I have some interesting reasons for the name of Little Rest. There's many different reasons. One of them was that Little Rest was the junction between Connecticut and the Hudson River and Amenia and Dover. So people would stop on their way through to water their horses and let their oxen have a rest. So the other one that I came across was that one farmer who spent some time working here said that he got little rest while working here. So this chapel was built approximately around 1870 to 1876. I wasn't able to determine an exact date. The deed that initiated the building of the chapel was dated 1869, and the church appeared on a map from 1876, so we can infer that it had been built by that point. It only cost $1,500 to build this chapel back in the 1870s, which isn't very much money today. It was built as a non-denominational church to serve the 20 or so families that were living in this area. Most people were farmers and just wanted a little chapel where they could worship. There was never any presiding minister here. They always invited ministers from area churches to come and preach here, depending on what they felt they needed at the time. Records at the Lyle Memorial Federated Church show that Reverend Lyle preached here from approximately 1884 to 1916. So there were also several marriages that occurred here during the late 19th century as well. Another event that went on here was there was a strawberry festival in 1893, and it was held to raise funds because the chapel needed to be repainted and was apparently in disrepair. So that also leads one to believe that it was standing for approximately 20 years if needed to be repaired in 1893. So there was also a Sunday school that was held here, and I'm assuming that it was held in the back room, although I was unable to find any documented proof of that. But as for what happened here in the chapel between 1916 and 1942 is somewhat of a mystery. No one really seems to know what happened here. The only event that I was able to come across was that there was a women's group, possibly the Red Cross, who met here during World War I to knit hats and gloves for the soldiers who were fighting in the war. And that was the last account I was able to find until Maria Tower bought the chapel in 1942 for $29.19. And at that time, the chapel was reported as being abandoned and unused, and she bought it at a tax sale. So the chapel, it appears that the chapel did not survive because it was built right around the turn of the century when there were great advances in transportation. And so those with transportation were more likely to take their transportation into town and attend the big churches instead of the small little community churches. Records showed that the chapel never really had more than 31 in attendance. I think 31 was the largest number that was ever recorded here, and that was in 1884 when the chapel was relatively new. So it was never a large congregation. And then as in the records I found that as time went on, the count declined to 13 and then 7 in attendance. And as the numbers dwindle, I figured that the ministry here at the Little Rest Chapel was coming to an end. So Maria Tower bought the chapel in 1942, and it remained unused as far as we know until the Perkins bought it in 1950, and they just used the back as storage. And they have held several private events here, including the wedding of their daughter in 1978. Following the wedding, Lyle Memorial Federated Church requested to hold summer services here, and they have been holding summer services here every year for the past 19 years. Currently, Carl Esmark, the minister at Lyle, has more ideas, which prompted my project here at the chapel. Starting in October, this chapel will be used as a healing chapel, and once the back room is carpeted, it will be used for a reception area and a counseling area. So this concludes my part of the presentation. I would now like to turn it over to Carmine, who will give you the history of the historical background of the union movement. Carmine?
There sits a future historian. She has done a good job here with her girls in the back especially, and tonight as well. She has presented the subject quite well. Now I don't know what I can say, except that this was part of a larger movement in the 19th century. The name, or part of the name, union, gives it away. There was a whole movement just before and after the Civil War, union movement. There were a number of churches here in Dutchess County which were part of that movement, beginning down at where New Haven prison is. Is that the name? All right. From there on through the valley, the town of Union Vale, I'll come to that in a moment, and then westward to Washington Hollow, and then north to Pine Plains. And there were churches all along the way. And in one way or another, they all reflect the name Union. And they were part of that movement. Now, around past the Civil War, just after the Civil War, a man by the name of Philetus Roberts came up from that Union Church organization in New Jersey. He had a relative here, a woman, I forget what the exact relationship was, but she had been working with those churches along that valley in the town of Uniondale. By the way, that's where the name comes from, because there was a chapel there in that road. It's still there now, but it has been moved slightly, which was part of the Union movement. And the town was named after it, obviously, Union Valley. When it was organized into a town, more of the territory was added, especially up on the heights. And so, but the name remained, Union Vale. It was part of it. Now, this Philetus Roberts, who came out from New Jersey, and his relative, a woman, had already been working with the churches here in the area, and he became a minister of the church in Stanfordville, which is still there and functioning today as the United Church of Christ. The word union or united cannot get away from it. And he was minister of that church for 30 years. And in Stanfordville, they had a seminary. They organized a school which was between Stanfordville and Bengal. And that school or seminary took in both men and women. Many of them became ministers and went on to serve. Aside from that strip of territory from the prison in Beekman all the way up to Pine Plains, they only came eastward here for this church and westward into Poughkeepsie. They had a church there as well. Now, there's a lot of history there, and obviously not for sale tonight. We are here to celebrate this church and to become acquainted with it as much as possible. The people who organized this church and built it were part of that movement. But unfortunately, records are gone, and we cannot prove anything. But the name itself, the name Union, is part of the name of this original church when it was first built, when it was first organized. The Union was part of the name. Now, there's no record that we know of in print anywhere that Philetus Roberts ever came here or preached here. He must have, but we don't know. They say he served for 30 years the church in Stanfordville, where they had the school and where they trained ministers. Now, I thought for a moment that Union Seminary in New York City was connected with it somehow. And I did some research on that. Perhaps it was, but Union Seminary was originally Presbyterian. It became independent because of some problems that they had there, but there's no connection mentioned in the history of it, which I just read not too long ago, with this church or all of the other churches along the way, which had the name Union. There was another seminary down south somewhere, also known as Union Seminary. Now, this Union movement, these little churches, were spread out all the way into Ohio, into the south, all the way from there to here and beyond. And originally it was Presbyterian, Congregational, and a couple of other churches. Now, the name Union obviously came about because they came into these communities where there were not enough people to have several churches. And they came from different denominations or different churches. So they organized these Union chapels, these Union churches. They were very fundamental in theology and left behind quite a tradition. Now, when transportation improved, and these little communities, like we have been told tonight, they only had 32 people in church, or was it 42?
32.
Yeah. All right, so how can a church subsist? How can a church survive that way? To pay a minister, expenses, eat, and whatever else. So eventually they died out. As transportation improved, people began to go to the larger churches in the nearby communities. From here, for instance, to Millbrook, where there were larger churches, and they could always find a service on Sunday morning. So all these little chapels, all these little churches eventually died out. Some have been rescued, like this one. The one in the Vale, or Union Vale, in the town of Union Vale, has also been revived a little bit now, and I forget what they call it. They used to meet in the old hall of the town, and they moved into the old church. And the one in Stanfordville obviously survived, but most of the others died out. There is no trace whatever of the one, for instance, in Washington Hollow. They're all gone. And it was a part of the transportation movement. Almost as soon as they were built, within a generation or two, they all began to die out, one at a time. Very few survived. The one in Stanfordville, this one, the one in Stanfordville actually is a minister in a congregation, but most of the others have just gone along with the history which kills all things in time.
Do we have any questions for Amy or Carmen? Is David? David, I'm glad you're here. Can you just tell us some of the architectural details of this church? I was going to ask you that. The window panes, things like that.
Sure. I'm sorry I was late. We ended up eating at the diner, and I should not have ordered the meatball.
Was it a union one, or?
Did you mention what the schedule for meeting next month will be?
No, because we didn't know.
Okay, let me say that first. Next month, we're going to, thank you. My wife just told me to stand up. Next month, the front, but we don't have to turn it around. Next month, we're going to be finding out about two projects that we're studying. One is on William Beardsley. Beardsley is an architect who was in the village of Millbrook in 1899, 1890, and 91, and is credited with the Thorne Building. We found out a great deal about him as a young architect, where his family came from, what his first commissions were. His major commission after the Thorne Building ended up being the courthouse in Poughkeepsie. And his last big commission that he was famous for is Attica Prison. You all know Attica in New York. When he died in 1933, Roosevelt said Beardsley knew more town politicians in New York State than he did. And the list of what he built is pretty extraordinary. So that's one part of next month. We'll be looking at the buildings. The second one, though, is one that a lot of you have interest in, and that's Uriah Swift and the Swift Coffee Mill, which was begun in the village of Millbrook, and eventually became known as the Lane Brothers and moved on into Poughkeepsie. So we'll find out about Uriah Swift, what the coffee mills were like, the catalogs that were produced, where they started, the patents that he did, and how we can find those today. There are lots of tag sales around Stormville. I've picked up several of them, so they're very, very common. So next month we'll be doing those two things, Beardsley and Uriah Swift. If any of you have coffee mills by Uriah Swift, bring them on in, because I know everyone loves a show and tell, and you'll be able to do that.
David, were you here for Amy's, the beginning of Amy's birthday?
Yes.
Okay. That's what I'd like you to correlate the dates that she has with the construction.
Standing on the inside of this building, if you didn't look closely at the hardware, the chapel looks much older than it is. If you didn't know, you'd think that it's 1790s, 1800 for the simplicity of the detailing. What gives it away are the door panels and the hinges on the doors. That's all typical of the third quarter of the 19th century. But the style basically is federal. It's a very simple box. The geometry is what's so important. The round-headed windows in the plated tradition, the fanlight over the breezeway door, and the columns, the pilasters in the front of it. They're all very much in that classical tradition of the early Republic. So that's what the inspiration was. One of the reasons I'm sure that it was selected is it was in direct reaction to the revival styles that were being created at the same time elsewhere. St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City is 1867. Think of how elaborate that is. Think of most of the other churches and chapels that are being developed in that period, and you'll realize they're very elaborate. Part of that fundamental movement that Carmine mentioned was getting back to basics. And they looked at these simple federal boxes where you can focus on the word and not the detail. So that's one of the reasons the chapel is as simple as it is. The focus was, what was your quote, Carmine? You said, was it one book? Do you remember the was it one book, the Bible, one word, the Lord? What was the saying that you had for that?
I had a saying tonight.
No, well, you didn't say it tonight, but before, about the Union movement, and it was based on the Bible. Do you remember what the saying was now?
No, I know what you mean, but I don't recall.
It was something clever on one book, the Bible, one word, the Lord, something like that. It was
something like that.
Very simple for it, but that's the reason for the architecture.
And the windows, are they original?
The idea is, I have a feeling looking at them that everyone knows Mr. Hazard, who did a lot of colonial revival trim in the 40s and 50s, and I suspect that he did some restoration work here, which is another reason it's so simple.
You know anything about, is that the organ?
The organs, yeah. As a matter of fact, anyone know Fanny Crosby? Does the name ring a bell, Fanny Crosby? Fanny Crosby, blind hymn writer in the 19th century. She popularized organs in chapels and churches. And most of these, looking at them, date from the 1860s to the 1880s. The catalogs, think of Sears Roebuck and so on. You could order them on installment, but that's a typical bellow organ. A word about music in the tradition of this period. If you were Presbyterian, if you were some of the fundamental Christian movements, music was not very popular. If there was any music at all, it would have been from the Psalms, and it would be sung without a musical instrument. Fanny Crosby started off as a Presbyterian and ended up joining that rabble group called the Methodists, who went out into the street and took barroom ballads and popular sailor songs, because everyone knew the music, and added Christian words to it. Things like Blessed Assurance, some of you may know that. That's one of her old chestnuts. Another is Safe in the Arms of Jesus. She wrote over 800 songs in her lifetime, and she was blind, which is pretty amazing. She was the first woman to speak in Congress, because it just so happened that she went to New York City for a school for the blind and ended up teaching there. But as a young student, she befriended the secretary to the president, and he would help her write. Well, his name was Grover Cleveland. And when he became president, he pushed and lobbied to have her come down. So she was the first handicapped person to speak in front of Congress because she was blind, and the first woman. Pretty amazing. She only had one enemy in her life, and that was P.T. Barnum, because P.T. Barnum wanted her to come and be central to his act, because she was a blind girl and she could memorize things and sing. It's interesting, they both ended up in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where they died. But Fanny Crosby was born in Dutchess County. At the time, it was Dutchess. It's now Putnam County, just south of us, in southeast. We have northeast as part of Dutchess. Southeast is in Putnam, and that's where her home is on Route 22 in Foggentown, near Worcester, New York. But she's a very active member of this part of the valley. So, I went off on a tangent, but that's what the organ is all about, bringing music into the chapels.
Hey, was there a bell?
I don't know about this one. I suspect, but I'm not sure. I see nodding. Okay.
I just want to thank everybody, and say that I think that our society is so lucky to have both Carmine and David to help us with all the different aspects of local history. And we're very, very lucky, and I want to appreciate both of you again and again. Secondly, I have to talk about Amy.
That's the story.
Carmine is always telling us, you know, Dutchess County and Millbrook in particular, and the town of Washington is steeped in the history of education. We have the first boarding school, co-ed boarding school. We have so many different ways of educating here in the town of Washington, the village of Millbrook, different institutions, small one-house schools, all the way up to the first boarding school. This brings a point about, are our students better students than other students because we have such a rich history in education? I take Amy as an example. As a 12th grader, can you think of yourself giving that same presentation when you were a senior in high school? I think I would have had a little bit of trouble. I have to say that if all our students are as good as Amy, there's nobody that can touch a Millbrook student. So I have to thank you again and again, Amy, because you did a great job. David brought something else to mind, and there's also something else that I should say. Those of you who don't know Amy's parents, Ed and Molly Olsen, are sitting in the back. All I said is the parents that make the child, so and not the other way around. So remember that. Stefano is here visiting us from Italy, and he is an art historian, and he is also visiting Millbrook. So we are also getting this international flavor. And Stefano, we welcome you to our...
We'll have to do a program in the spring.
Okay, you'll have to do a program in the spring. Okay, great. Another reminder, please take calendars, please. And so Alison doesn't have to keep carrying it back and forth in the car. And anybody wants an extra one? Now, I think, Amy, do you want us to just go into the other room? And do you want to talk about it at all?
No, and we can just go in there and I'll answer any questions that anybody wants to ask in there.
Okay, so, sorry.
One real quick thing. I have a listing of some events going on around the county also.
Oh, you want to talk about those?
No, I don't really want to talk about them. There are a number of them actually going on over in New Paltz, I think, and on all sorts of things, including archiving and that sort of thing. I'll just put it on the table when it takes the back. I just want people to know that it's available to look at.
Great.
There's like a lot of good programs.
We're going to have some juicy cookies in the other room, and the other room is what Amy restored. And so please ask her lots of questions. Let's go to the other room. Thank you for all coming.